Well, Benjamin Franklin famously said, "Nothing in this world can be said to be certain except death and taxes." Well, I'll add one more. You will die, you will pay taxes, and you will have conflict. Yep. As long as you live in this world, you will at some point get sideways with other people about what you think, what you say, or what you do. So think for a minute about the last time you experienced conflict. Maybe you and your spouse had a disagreement. Maybe your boss made a decision that you didn't agree with. Maybe your child didn't obey curfew. Maybe the school has a policy in place that you're not okay with. Or maybe your roommate ate all the food and used all the toilet paper. It happens. Conflict happens everywhere people are. Homes, neighborhoods, schools, businesses, works, friendship, family, and of course, the internet. Now, some conflicts are just simple misunderstandings. No one on earth communicates perfectly 100% of the time. And we misunderstand each other, our impatience or our prejudice. We jump and we perceive conflict where maybe there isn't any. We take offense. We assume the worst in people. And some conflicts exist just because of God-given differences in us. God created us all uniquely. We all have different personalities and preferences and priorities and passions and convictions. And sometimes those rub up against another person. But it kind of keeps life interesting, and it can help us learn. It can help us grow, see someone else's viewpoint. Sometimes we have conflict just because of the way that God created us differently. But sometimes conflict is more serious. We do real harm to other people. We sin against them, they sin against us. We find ourselves in deep, hurtful conflicts like custody battles and divorces, church splits, and family estrangements. So I don't have to think very long about the last time that I was in conflict. I happen to find myself in conflict a lot. Going to be talking about that a little bit this weekend, but a couple days ago, just a few nights ago, I was making dinner. I was doing chicken and vegetables, and I looked up at the clock and realized the timing is off on this whole thing. There's no way that I can get the vegetables prepped and in the oven and the chicken prepped and cooking and it all come together at the same time. And my children were going to be circling like sharks or wolves, declaring that they were starving to death if I did not hurry up. So I thought, well, you know what would be helpful? I'll just go ask my husband if he would help with the chicken. He says, sure. So he comes, he asks me what I need him to do, and I explain to him about seasoning the chicken, putting it in the cooker, and he says, okay. So I turn around and I'm chopping the vegetables, and he says, hey, I need you to come over here and season this chicken. I said, I can't come over and season the chicken. I asked you to season the chicken because the whole point is that I'm doing the vegetables, so if I walk away from the vegetables, I come season the chicken. He's like, but it doesn't make any sense for me to season the chicken. I've already touched the raw chicken and my hands have raw chicken on them. So to season it, I'm gonna have to first wash my hands and get the seasoning and put them on. Then I'm gonna have to touch the chicken again and put it in the cooker. So it'd just be easier if I just stand here over the sink with the chicken on my hands while you come season the chicken. I was like, I don't think you understand. If I come season the chicken, then I can't do the vegetables. And if I were in the kitchen doing dinner all by myself, do you know what I would do? I would wash my hands and I would season the chicken, and then I would maybe wash my hands. He's like, that doesn't make any sense. He's like, well, I'm not gonna wash my hands. So I go over and I season the chicken, because at this point I'm like, we may not eat this chicken before I retire if we don't stop having this argument. So I season the chicken, but I'm very, very angry about seasoning the chicken. So it's not going really great. And he goes, so I stopped talking altogether, because what I've learned in therapy is when I sort of reached this point that I was at, is that it's real helpful for me to just take some deep breaths, say some calming things, try not to react. And then he says, so you're not going to talk to me because of chicken. I said, no, actually, I'm not going to talk to you because you are being so ridiculously unhelpful. I don't know why I thought you would be helpful. And then he says, well, I don't know why you would call me in here and ask me to do something so inefficient is what you just asked me to do. And that is the story about how chicken ruined our entire evening. But it might be more accurate to say that that is how a battle of wills ruined our whole evening. Because you see, most conflict, the root of the conflict is that we don't get what we want. People don't do what we think they should do. They don't act the way we think they should act. They don't say what we think that they should say. And we end up disagreeing. But conflict gets a bad rap because it's so hard and it's so difficult. But not all conflict is bad. Conflict can actually be good if it's handled in a loving, mature, and constructive way. The Bible calls it iron sharpening iron. It's the way that we grow. It's the way that we are challenged. It's the way that we think differently, the way that we learn. Conflict can actually have good, positive effects if we learn to handle conflict in the right way. The problems occur when conflict is handled in a way that is destructive. It can be disastrous. Anger, unforgiveness, resentment, wounds, scars, they all settle into the places where conflict hurts us. And working towards peaceful solutions, that's not instinctive to our nature. Learning how to handle conflict a biblical way is a learned skill, and it takes a lot of hard work and practice. But in order to learn how to handle conflict the biblical way, we must first unlearn the things that we've internalized along the way. In this series, Unlearning, we're examining things that we know, things that we've learned along the way, things that we know about God and ourselves and how we treat others in order to challenge ourselves to grow and to become more like Christ in our everyday lives. And when it comes to conflict, we have to first unlearn what our nature, the way that we are wired, and our nurture, the homes that we grew up in, have taught us about conflict. Now, the whole nature, nurture, and how those two things fit together have long been the debate of the psychological community, but they both play a part in the way that we learn responses to conflict. And I learned this myself recently. My brother and I are both in therapy. We've been in therapy for a number of years, working through the way that the conflict that we experienced in our childhood home has affected us in our lives. You see, the home that I grew up in was marked with a lot of anger, angry outbursts, emotional manipulation. We lived in fear of severe punishment, and when the next sort of like outburst might happen and what it would be over, it wasn't a home where we felt safe. Now, my brother and I both came to know Jesus in our 20s after a long, dark, hard period of rebellion. And as Jesus began to heal us and Jesus began to grow us and move in our lives, we began to have real, honest, and open conversations about the lingering effects, the way that we saw our childhood home affecting our marriages, our relationships, our friendships, our workplace, every aspect of our lives. And I guess a little over a year ago, we were working through some conflict when I began to get really frustrated with him. You see, there were things that I can remember so clearly that happened, situations where I know he was there that he doesn't have any memories of. And we've been trying to work through conflict resolution in our family, and I felt like we weren't getting anywhere because he couldn't remember all the things that I could remember. We were driving in the car, and I was on my way to therapy, and we were having this conversation, and we were talking about this specific incident that in my mind, I can see him there, and he has no memory of it, and I was so frustrated, and we ended the conversation in anger, and I go into my therapist's office, and I'm bawling my eyes out, and I tell her, I just have this outburst. I'm like, why can't he remember? I know that I am not crazy. I feel so alone in these memories, so alone. Like, why can't he remember? How do I have memories that my brother doesn't have? And she handed me a Kleenex, and she began to explain to me things about conflict that not only helped my brother and I relate better, helped us become more aware of the way that we handle conflict, but really has helped me relate to other people. It has changed the way that I see conflict in other people. She began to talk about the different ways that people respond to conflict and how that affects them. And she told me about these two: escape and attack. You see, my brother, he's a classic escaper. And so his internal wiring told him conflict is bad, run away, avoid, get away as fast as you can, deny, forget. And in some ways, this is good because his brain protected him from remembering destructive memories that he was too young to process. But in other ways, it's developed patterns where he has become conflict avoidance as he grew older. Me, I am a textbook attacker. And you see, my wiring under conflict told me fight, assault, hurt, strike first, never let your guard down, never forget. And in a lot of ways, my brain helped me because I was the older sibling and I saw myself as the protector, as the defender. And so I was always on alert, ready to protect us both from whatever conflict came our way. But in other ways, it has affected me because now I look for conflict even when there isn't a conflict. I believe that conflict is the way to communicate. It's the way that I know to communicate. And I've been told that conflict is my love language. You see, we have these responses, and let's talk about the escaper for a minute. So the escaper, maybe you recognize this in yourself, is focused on running, avoiding, denying. You may have heard this as the flight. Funny escapes, I have friends that I sort of ask, like, so tell me the way escaping has worked out in your life. A friend told me about the time that she ate a wrong food in a restaurant, even though she was allergic to it because she was too afraid to tell the waiter that her order was wrong. Another friend told me that she took the wrong college class for an entire semester because she was too afraid to tell the professor that she was in the wrong room. Escapers may quit jobs, they may leave the house in arguments, they may shut down, but they may be more extreme. They may leave churches, leave small group, leave friends, move entire cities. Escapers are generally looking for the easiest and most convenient way to get away from the source of conflict. And honestly, escapers can be convinced that this is the healthy, most helpful way to handle conflict. I mean, it does seem more peaceful. And in Christian circles, I think the escaper can feel really validated. Because isn't this what a Christian is? Someone who keeps the peace, who goes the flow, who doesn't insist that their needs be met or that they get their way. And the challenge for escapers is that they must learn that some battles, some conflicts require engaging, that their voice and their perspective is needed. And escapers have to learn to advocate for themselves and for their needs and for others and to have courage to address conflict. So let's talk about the attacker. Attackers are more interested in winning than preserving a relationship. We see conflict as a contest, a chance to assert control, to demand it be done my way, to fight. You see, attackers usually take one of two paths. Some attackers, like me, attack the instant they perceive conflict, or sniff it out, maybe. And then other attackers, they attack when the escape route didn't work, when they can't avoid anymore, when they're pushed too far, when they can't ignore or run away, then they flip and they attack. Do you know what's really fun is having two attackers, both paths, in the same marriage. Isn't it, babe? So fun. Let me tell you some funny things that attackers do. I didn't have to ask anybody. I can tell you about mine. Attackers might approach you in a store and let you know what you're doing wrong. Random person. Or an attacker might roll down their window to yell out the window to let you know that you're riding your bike in the wrong direction on the wrong side of the road. Attackers might slam doors. They might threaten to sue. They may confront you about everything from making chicken to taking the trash out. And the most common response, the most common method that attackers use is assault. Now that can be physical, it can be damage to property, but the most common way that plays out is through the verbal assault. Hurtful words, sometimes veiled in sarcasm or humor. But saying I didn't really mean it and why are you so sensitive doesn't make words less destructive. Whatever the form of assault, it always makes conflict worse. Trust me, I know. For attackers, the challenge is learning that not every battle needs fighting, and starting battles isn't helpful either. Attackers need to learn to let some things go and not to look for a fight around every corner. Unlearning these messages and responses isn't easy. I've been working on this for most of my adult life. This past week, Rob and I sat down with Dr. Pudester from the Woodlands Family Institute. And she and Rob and I had a great conversation around conflict that's going to be out this week on our Loft Living Room podcast. I hope you'll take a listen because she really got into these types. She even mentioned a third type and gave some real practical ways that both escapers and attackers can communicate. And so I hope you'll take a listen to that. You may also find out that if I were given the choice between being in a fight with Rob Renfro or a bear, which one I would choose. It's riveting content. You got to check it out this week on the Loft Living Room podcast. But today, let's talk about what is the biblical approach to conflict. Well, it looks very different than what you might think, and it certainly looks different from what culture around us promotes. But if we put these truths into practice, we will see conflict transform us and change the world around us. And the first truth that we must learn is this: the way we respond to conflict can prove we are followers of Jesus. Jesus said in John chapter 13, verse 34, he said, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." Before he went to the cross, Jesus predicted that we would have conflict. The same conflict that we see today in our homes, in our neighborhood, in our world, Jesus said we would have trouble. He let us know that we would, and yet he still told us that we should be known for love. You see, sometimes I think that the ideal that Jesus lays out for us, that we would be known by love, even in the face of disagreements and conflict and hurts, feels a little bit unrealistic. I mean, sure, I want to be known for love, and I like the idea that being known for love means that I help my neighbor. I really like the idea that being known for love means that I give donations to people who are struggling from the hurricane. I love that it means that I work at the food pantry or that I donate food to feed the hungry. That's the kind of love I want to be known for. But to love people that I strongly disagree with, to love people who hurt me, who use hurtful words, who argue with me, who stir up trouble, who seem to almost want me to respond in an unloving way, that makes it really easy to justify unloving responses to them. Have you ever noticed when you have a conflict where your focus naturally falls? Here's a hint. It's not on us. It's not internal. It's usually on the other person. We begin to make a list of what they've done wrong, what they should have said different, what the grievances are. We sort of elevate their sin above ours. I don't know about you, but I love to sort of rewrite history in my head where they did everything wrong and I had no part of it, and I couldn't help but be unloving. If only they hadn't said that. If only they had used a different tone of voice when they said it. If only they hadn't brought up that topic at the dinner table, then I wouldn't have had to respond in such an unloving way. And we can convince ourselves that we are justified in our unloving responses, that we had to be angry, we had to set them straight, we had to gossip about them, we had to talk about them online, we had to say hurtful things. They deserved it. It's easy to decide love is not an option in the midst of terrible relational conflict. Bob Goff says, the way we treat people we disagree with most is a report card on what we've learned about love. A pastor I once worked with taught what it means to show love in our daily lives, even in conflict. He read from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, you know, the passage that we pull out at weddings usually. And when he did, he encouraged us to read it with our names in the place of love. I'm going to do that today, and as I read along with my name, I want you to think about your name in this passage. Does love define you? 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4. Luann is patient. Luann is kind. Luann does not envy. Luann does not boast. Luann is not proud. Luann does not dishonor others. Luann is not self-seeking. Luann is not easily angered. Luann keeps no record of wrongs. Luann does not delight in evil, but rejoices with truth. Luann always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. When I hold myself up to that standard of the biblical standard of love, when I put myself in that verse, it is easy for me to see when I'm unloving. It is clear that I need to evaluate my heart and confess my wrongdoings first. Loving others, honoring God in our conflicts, it doesn't preclude us from tackling difficult issues. It doesn't mean that we don't make our differences known or that express our convictions or engage in the hard work of conflict resolution. However, it does mean that we must attend to our hearts and define our engagement by love. But there is no way that we can do that on our own. The disciple John, known as the one Jesus loved, wrote this in 1 John chapter 4. He said, "This is how God showed love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins." Dear friends, since God so loved us, we ought to love one another. The love that I have to offer comes only because Christ loved me first. God is kind to me. I can be kind to others. God is patient with me. I can be patient with others. God sent his Son and sacrificed for me. I can sacrifice for others. It is a love that is steeped in grace and mercy, and it is beautiful when it is lived out. Brothers and sisters, let us be known by love. Let us show the world this radical love that we have received even in the face of conflict. The second truth about engaging conflict is our words have purpose and power. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. And the earth, it was dark, it was without form, and God said, "Let there be." God used words. He used language to call everything into existence. He used his words to create order out of chaos. And God gives us words. He gives us language to create. He gives it as tools to build and redeem and restore. He gives us words that create poetry and poems and songs and restaurant menus and sermons and everything that can be creating things in this world and to use in our relationships. God gives us words to name our babies. Studies suggest that the average American adult speaks 16,000 words per day. Multiply that by a lifespan of 70 years for a total of 409 million words. I'm telling you, Matthew 12:36 does not sit well when you think of that, when it says, "But I tell you that everyone will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every empty word they have spoken." Not super encouraging for someone who likes to use her words as weapons. Her words have purpose. They have weight. They have power. And when we use our words, we dare to participate in the redemptive work of the word. We can speak life and light into dark and dying places. We can use our words to lift prayers to heaven that hit God's ears. We can build, we can restore, we can redeem, we can confront broken places in our world, in our society, and in our systems, and we can speak truth about sin in the lives of other people. And that's the part we really like, speaking truth. We like to be on the right side. We like to take scripture and our right viewpoint and our moral viewpoint, and we like to use it to speak into every person, every sin, sometimes shouting and typing as loudly as we can. I enjoy the fact that the Bible gives me permission to speak truth. I may take a little too much enjoyment or pride in it, but it's only part of how we're instructed to use our words. Paul writes, "Instead of speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ." Speaking the truth is more than just telling it like it is. It's more than just giving someone a piece of our mind. It's more than just publicly calling out sin in every person that we've met, maybe know or see online, because as followers of Jesus, we can't just be concerned with what is true and what is right. We also must be concerned with what is honoring and what is loving. One of my favorite authors, Tish Warren, tells about this time that she worked in campus ministry at Vanderbilt University. In 2011, the administration of Vandy told on-campus organizations that they could no longer have their student leaders sign doctrinal statements. So there could no longer be a belief statement in their organization, or they would not be allowed to be on campus. And as a Christian organization, they took a problem with this. And so Tish was one of the people assigned to do the writing. She published blogs. She wrote letters to administration pleading their behalf. She wrote news releases for magazines and news media. It became a widely nationally covered issue. She says that early into the controversy, her supervisor charged her team to never write or speak anything that did not represent who they were as followers of Jesus. Her supervisor said, "Above all, we are called to love. We must talk and write about these things with whom we disagree carefully and respectfully." Tish writes, "It was not easy to articulate in writing our differences in a way that honored the administration. Our more nuanced task was to disagree publicly and try, however fumbling and imperfectly, to use words and arguments that were truthful yet humble and that respected the dignity of those with whom we were arguing. To be people who spoke and wrote with conviction, who resisted the short-lived sweetness of self-righteous vitriol." And here's what she found. She said the way that they used their words began to shape and form them. The more generous they wrote, the more generous they felt. The more kind and gracious and loving and honoring they felt towards those that they disagreed with, the more they wrote that way, the more they felt that way, the more they saw people that way. And she began to understand this core principle. She says, we cannot simply speak uncomfortable truths to be right, or worse, be pleased with ourselves. Our task is to communicate to others the meaningful vision of human flourishing, a way to know God that makes people long for it to be true. I long for people to know God. I long for people to experience the healing and the transformation and the power in their lives that comes from knowing Jesus and having a relationship with him. And I want my words, I want the things that I say to draw them in, to paint the picture of what it's like to have such a kind and loving and graceful Father. And that means then that there are times that I should not be speaking. The Bible says the power of the tongue holds life and death. And there are times then that Luann Riley's tongue should not be moving. For example, there's plenty in the Bible, trust me, but here's a list. We should not speak in the heat of anger, when you aren't listening, when the issue is none of your business, when you are tempted to lie, when you feel critical, when it's time to listen, when I'm tempted to insult someone, when you should be working. As followers of Jesus, we cannot be careless with our words. The way that we engage conflict proves that we belong to Jesus, and our words have purpose and power. And the third truth is this: we must never lose sight of the image of God in other people. There are disturbing trends in the way that we relate and communicate with each other after the explosion of social media. Turkle, she's a clinical psychologist with MIT. She has spent the last 30 years observing how people react and adapt to new technologies that allow us to communicate in a different way. Studies have found, and she has done years of studies have found that we have lost the ability to empathize with other people. It has seen a dramatic decline. Now, empathy is the process, the psychological process of where we can place ourselves in the lives of other person, where we can put ourselves in their situation and we can imagine, we can feel, we can know what they may be going through. Texts, tweets, Facebook posts, emails, instant messages, Snapchat. She says all of these rapid fire sips of online communications have had consequences. There has been a sharp decline in our ability to understand and talk with those who have different views and beliefs. And this lack of empathy has led to the rise of what is known as dehumanization. And dehumanization is the process of assigning an enemy image in another person. We demonize that person, we make them less humane and therefore not as worthy of humane treatment. And as we lump those people together, as we assign characteristics to them, as we take sides, we begin to lose even more trust, and then we lose our ability to really listen to them and communicate. The angrier we get, the more we solidify this image of the enemy. Once we classify people on the other side as morally inferior, we can now make our arguments about good versus evil, and all bets are off. I know you've seen it. You have fallen victim to dehumanization when you begin to speak or write about those people, them, when you have lumped people into categories who are different than you, who you don't agree with, in order to be able to treat them differently. Now, while most people in society today have become experts at creating categories of people and making them faceless entities, this is a particularly dangerous way for Christians to relate. You see, when you begin assigning words or thoughts or ideas for people that disconnect them from the image of God, it becomes more serious. When we begin to assign worth and value to people based on what they do, based on how they act, and based on what they believe, we have lost sight of the image of God in our fellow humans. And there's an important truth that we forget, that we are all created in God's image. Not just me, not just you, not just Christians, everyone created in God's image, created for a purpose in our mother's wombs. And this should change the way that we see and relate to people. A professor named Stephen Mattson explains and challenges this way: the simple fact that God created and loves everyone can have radically profound implications on our opinions of others when we start replacing the idea of people with individuals made in the image of God. Think about it. What difference would it make if you think this way? Your coworkers, created and loved by God. Your neighbors, created and loved by God. Your family, your relatives, created and loved by God. Strangers, ones you see in the store, ones you see in the restaurant, ones that cut you off in traffic, created and loved by God. Conservatives and liberals, created and loved by God. Protesters and police, created and loved by God. Criminals and terrorists, created and loved by God. Our faith in Jesus asks us to find the face of God in everyone we meet. I don't have to convince you that the world is hurting. I don't have to convince you that you will face and see conflict daily. You see it. We live in a broken world, in broken societies, in broken families, and broken communities. We all feel the weight of it. But I hope that I can convince you that the world needs you. The world needs us. It needs us to be different. The world needs us to engage in conflict that is rooted and grounded in love, to radically love and show grace and mercy in a way that goes, wow, those people are really different. The world needs us to use our words in a way that has power and purpose to build and redeem and restore and create positivity and an image of the world that what it could be with God. And the world needs us to never lose sight of the image of God in every person we meet. Let me pray. Father, we live in a world that is facing so much conflict. You don't even have to turn on the news. You can just check your social media feed or engage with a friend about what's happening in the world. And it's just so much conflict raging around us, God. And I confess that sometimes I can become so engaged in that conflict and so prone to us versus them and so self-righteous about speaking truth or being on the side of truth or saying what is right, God, that we forget that these are people that you love. That God, you created them in your image, that they are our fellow humans here, God, and that I am called to love. And I am called to engage in a way with my words, God, that paints a picture of you and relationship with you. So God, won't you give us your spirit powerfully inside us that enables us to love as you loves us, who enables us to speak when the time is right and to be quiet when it's not time to speak, God. And gives us your eyes and your heart to see every person around us as created and loved by you. Amen.